Super Mario Bros. Is currently the game with the 5th highest number of sales ever, at over 40 million. Many more people will have played the game from their friends or family, and with emulators being a fairly common way to play retro games now, whether developers like that or not, this is likely to have helped a few million more have their own experience playing the game. It's the first of its kind in video game history, and it more or less revived the video game industry when it was released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985. Considering this game is now 34 years old, it's perhaps not up to standard with the games people play and grow up with now, but it's important to understand how this was so revolutionary to people when it was initially released, or perhaps even to people in the current day who have never played a video game before. It sounds strange to say it now, but this was one of the largest games ever released at the time, not counting loops, which many very early games did to try and prolong themselves by changing very minor aspects of the same stage layouts. 32 levels in a single loop of the same game must have been absolutely glorious. There's very good progressive difficulty in these levels, with many secrets such as hidden blocks and hidden paths leading to warp zones to later levels, and to top it all off, there's a very memorable and catchy soundtrack. Constant music was practically unheard of in video games before this point, which I'm sure had a big impact on its players when it was released. But enough context waffle, it's time to finally look into the game properly. The stage design is simple, but it brought many ideas to the world about how good levels could be designed, and how these simple designs could be improved upon. I think that stage 1-1 is a perfect first stage for the game. Yes, it's very easy, but it introduces you to the controls nicely, offers you all of the game's power-ups so you can try them all up, and introduces you to standard enemies. These enemies are by no means difficult to pass, as you can simply jump over them, or in the case of Goombas you can even jump on them to squash them, so that you won't be bothered by them again. The level also shows you that pipes are a common part of the game, and you can even go down some of them to find bonus areas. There are plenty of coins to collect, bricks to break for fun if you have a mushroom power-up, and even invisible blocks to find with extra hidden bonuses. What's more, it's probably got the most well-known video game song of all time playing in the background, which just makes the game feel so happy, and really encourages you to keep playing. The 32 levels in the game are split into 8 different worlds, slowly increasing in difficulty as you move through them. Each of these 8 worlds contains 4 levels, which are similar in theme. Only vaguely though, since the limited graphics make each of the worlds very similar. The ground texture is the same for the regular levels and the supposedly snowy levels, for example, which instead have white bushes and trees and sometimes pipes, which don't really look great. Each world starts off with the most common kind of level in the game, being above ground, and each world ends with a castle level, which is very often the most difficult level in the world, which makes sense with progressive difficulty. Each of the castles ends with Bowser guarding the princess. Oh wait! Just kidding. It was one of Bowser's minions disguised as him, guarding some kidnapped toads, I guess? And they will always thank Mario or Luigi and tell them that the princess is in another castle, every single time, for 7 worlds. And that's just about the only story we get in this game. How riveting. Only in the 8th and final castle will you find the real Bowser guarding the real princess, who is unnamed at this time. There are 2 other main stage types in the game, but both types only had 2 main levels in the entire game, and all 4 of these levels were the second level in a world, beginning with the game showing you entering a pipe. Both of these types of levels changed the color of the ground tiles to fit more with the theme, which makes me wonder why they couldn't have done this where they wanted the theme of the levels above ground to be snowy. The first of these level types that you'll run into is the underground level. I really like how everything has a different color palette underground. It's not just the ground tiles, but the enemies are darker as well. Mario and Luigi are kept the same color, but I think that's a fair decision made. Both of the underground levels will have warp zones to lead to later worlds if you want to skip ahead, which are found in secret places, but shouldn't be too hard to find. The other type of level in the game is the underwater level. This first appears in World 2 and is fairly simple, with a couple of new enemies scattered about, the bloopers and Cheep Cheeps. They're not very difficult to avoid at all here. Something odd about underwater areas in Super Mario Bros. 1 is that when there is no ground tile below you, it's as if the game tries to suck you down into a pit. so you have to make sure that you are constantly tapping the A button to make sure you don't fall in. This first underwater level is followed by another level above ground, but you're crossing lots of bridges and the only enemy found is more of the Cheep Cheeps from before, now randomly jumping out of the water below which isn't actually visible. The other underwater level in the game appears in World 7, and is again followed by a level above ground crossing bridges and having Cheep Cheeps jump at you. Hold on a minute. Aren't these level layouts almost exactly the same as the ones in World 2? Well, yes, that is the case, and they've just thrown in a bunch of extra enemies and more gaps to make it harder. The truth is that there is a lack of level variety throughout the game in Super Mario Bros. Not just with the example I used with the water levels, but quite frequently once you get to the latter half of the game, where you will start to see familiar layouts with added hazards. Unfortunately, the NES cartridge wasn't developed very much at this point, and this caused Nintendo to make perhaps different decisions than they would have liked with the game as a whole. While this was one of the longest games at the time of release, it's not without a bit of repetitiveness, and the hardware limitations may be to blame for this. They caused other strange decisions such as with the graphics, when you can see that the sprite for the bushes is a recolor of the same sprite as the clouds. And when Mario and Luigi have a fire flower power-up, they look exactly the same. Also, with every level scrolling to the right as you move forward, you are unable to then go back to the left because the screen locks in place, which is a strange limitation and doesn't allow much room for error in some of the stages, since you can't always reposition yourself to make a hard jump, for example. Despite these hardware limitations, there is still a second quest featured in the game after you beat the game. However, the level layouts are this time exactly the same as the previous 32 levels, just with some replaced enemies to make it a harder task, which perhaps could have been done better without such limitations. Another main area that was potentially affected by the hardware limitations is the variety in the soundtrack of the game. The underground theme, the castle theme, and the ending theme all loop in about 10 seconds, and the underwater theme loops in under 25, which is a considerable improvement but still relatively short. All of that being said, I did mention earlier how revolutionary the music really was. The music really does suit the game very nicely, and having a soundtrack accompany you throughout the game was powerful when the game was first released. From this point on, all Mario music would aim to be happy and catchy, and this game's composer, Koji Kondo, would go on to be a successful music writer for many games in more series than just this one. Every theme used in Super Mario Bros. 1 would be a classic and iconic and reused several times later, for good reason. It set the tone for later Mario games, having relaxing music on underwater stages and having mysterious music for underground stages, which works brilliantly. One last thing I should talk about is simply how the game plays. Firstly, the controls. Some people would say it controls horribly. It can be a little bit difficult to warm up to, but once you are able to beat the early stages in the game to get the feel down, you should be able to work with them from there. The main issue is the momentum from jumping, but other than that, I don't really see why anyone would have trouble with it. I suppose you could argue that you don't want to hold the run button all the time in the later stages, but at the same time playing the game without running is rather boring. So, to avoid having no momentum or too much momentum, you just need to be extra careful about whether you're holding a direction to move on the D-pad before you hit the jump button. There's just a slight issue with deaths. Super Mario Bros. Is by no means an easy game, which is quite common of the NES games. It's not the hardest either, but starting out with only 3 lives and having game overs force you going back to the beginning of the first level is extremely punishing. Fortunately, there are some secret button combinations you can press on the title screen in order to go back to the beginning of the world you had just played, but plenty of people were not aware of this. Starting with only 3 lives is harsh and forces you to hunt for 1-up mushrooms and collect coins, as you will get a 1-up for every 100 coins you collect, which is cool, I guess, but at the same time I don't feel this should have been forced for players to have a chance to beat the game if they're not the sharpest player out there. To sum up everything we've talked about, everything is good, except for where Nintendo ran into limitations with the cartridges they were using. They did an amazing job with what they had, and many people are still buying this game because it's where the magic all started. but the game perhaps doesn't hold up today as well as it did 34 years ago. Therefore, my final score for Super Mario Bros. For the NES will be 7.4 out of 10. The game overs are harsh with a life cap, but the game can still be enjoyable, even today. With different physics to any game I've ever played, it will take some getting used to, but it's not too hard to learn. If you don't want to play with save states, or perhaps with the Wii U Virtual Console's restore points, as I'll admit I used, the remake on the SNES in Super Mario All-Stars is a good option to choose. It still plays the same way with the slightly clunky physics, but it's certainly true to the original game in that way. But the best difference is the game over system, which only takes you back to the beginning of the world when you run out of lives, and you also start out with 5 lives instead of only 3. Not to mention the improved graphics and much more clear theming to the different levels. Tell me, did you agree with the points I've made? What rating would you give Super Mario Bros. For the NES, released in 1985? As ever, thank you for watching, and please continue to be your own unique self. Which part is sad? Me using restore points, this entire game, our lives? I'm a legend!
Thank you, Mario. Your quest is over. We present you a new quest. Push button B to select a world.